Good morning and welcome to Tuesday Tune-Up. Last week we reviewed the early history of the Church of England, including its development of the Book of Common Prayer. Today we will review the early history of the Episcopal Church in America and how it related to the development of the prayer book we use today. As we heard during our first session, Episcopalians traced their religious roots back to the 16th century, when Anglicanism emerged as a distinct denominational tradition out of the Protestant Reformation in the Church of England. It continued to grow, and by 1700, it was the second largest religious denomination in America, second only to the Congregational Church. The number of parishes in Virginia alone grew from 48 to 16 in 1671 to 53 in 1726 to 107 by the time of the American Revolutionary War. But then everything changed. Known as the Church of England in America, the church embraced the powerful symbols of the British imperial presence in the colonies: the monarchy, the episcopate, the stately language of the Book of Common Prayer. Because of the American Revolution and the overthrow of the old colonial social order, Anglicans faced an acute challenge to the religious tradition and came to the brink of extinction. Not only was their social order disrupted, but they had several other major problems. First, the Anglican Church in the newly formed United States of America did not have a bishop. Secondly, all clergy in the Anglican Church were required to swear allegiance to the King of England. Thirdly, clergy were required to read the Book of Common Prayer verbatim during each worship service. As such, they were required to pray for the king, the royal family, and for the English Parliament. This was a big deal. Since beginning July 4th, 1776, such prayers were considered acts of treason. So what was a priest to do? Many clergy left America. Those who stayed stopped conducting worship services. Essentially, all Anglican churches closed during the war. The Book of Common Prayer made Anglican worship in America impossible. To make matters worse, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution separated church from state. Up until this time, the Anglican Church was closely tied to government, and most of its support came from taxes mandated by colonial governments. What little remained of the Anglican Church after the American Revolution had to change. Its leaders knew this, and they sought to refashion the denomination by preserving the theological and liturgical features of Anglicanism, while at the same time shedding those elements that bound it to the British government. It is not hard to imagine that the name Church of England was highly unpopular after the war. So a group of Anglican clergy and laity held their first convention in Chesterton, Maryland in 1780. It was during this convention that our new name was formed, Protestant Episcopal Church. The word Protestant was chosen to differentiate our denomination from the Roman Catholics, and the word Episcopalian was chosen to signify that we retained the ministry and authority of the bishops. From the beginning, Episcopalians have emphasized that our church includes both Catholic as well as Protestant elements. In other words, via media continues to be a core principle of the Episcopal Church. Two great Episcopal leaders rose up immediately after the war. The first was William White. He was the rector of Christ Church in Philadelphia, and he had worked closely with many of the founding fathers of the United States, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. William White believed that worship services in the newly named Protestant Episcopal Church should conform closely to the worship in the Church of England. The other man was Samuel Seabury, a former SPG missionary in New York, and he believed the episcopate was a foundation upon which any Christian organization should be erected. In 1785, William White met with 7 states for the first General Convention of the Episcopal Church. The 3 New England states did not attend because there was no provision for Samuel Seabury to preside. Clearly, a rift existed between the states supporting Seabury and those supporting White. Important actions resulting from the convention included a plan to obtain consecration of bishops in the United States by bishops in the Church of England. This was consequently approved by the Church of England. Next, a draft version of the first church constitution was developed, evenly sharing power between clergy and laity. Then a preliminary American version of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer was created, eliminating all references to the British sovereign. The first convention also made several liberal changes to the prayer book, including elimination of both the Athanasian Creed and the Nicene Creed, and they removed the phrase, "He descended to hell," from the Apostles' Creed. All these changes were rejected by Samuel Seabury and his followers. The General Convention met again in 1786 and 1787, but still the rift existed between Seabury and White and their followers. Finally, White and Seabury reached a compromise, and by the end of 1789 General Convention, much of the church structure we have today was created, including establishment of 2 houses sharing power at General Convention, the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies. The Protestant Episcopal Church now had 3 bishops recognized by all members, including Samuel Seabury, William White, and Samuel Provost. Seabury had been earlier consecrated by Scottish bishops, and White and Provost were more recently consecrated by English bishops. This allowed the Episcopal Church to consecrate its own future bishops, ordain priests, and perform confirmation of new members. The first bishop consecrated by the American bishops was James Madison, Bishop of Virginia, who eventually became President of the United States. Finally, during the 1789 General Convention, the first fully authorized version of the Book of Common Prayer was created, and its use through the denomination was made mandatory. The prayer book restored the word regeneration to the prayers in the baptismal service, added the phrase, "He descended to hell," back into the Apostles' Creed, and added the Nicene Creed. The sign of the cross was quite controversial and considered Catholic. Many of the Protestants in the Episcopal Church disapproved of its use. However, others believed it was an important part of the liturgy. A compromise was eventually reached, giving clergy permission to decide whether or not to use the sign of the cross. Another great example of via media. You may notice that during our worship services, the Reverend Rick O'Brien uses the sign of cross much more often than I do. Rick grew up in the Catholic Church. I grew up in an Episcopal church that was considered low church, which means it was more Protestant and less Catholic in its worship rituals. Since 1793, our Book of Prayer has been revised 8 times. In 1822, in 1832, in 1838, in 1845, in 1871, in 1892, and then 1928, which is the prayer book I grew up with, and 1979, which is the prayer book we currently use. Also, options to the prayer book have been approved by General Convention and are included in a series of books titled Enriching Our Worship. I will discuss these books during later sessions. This ends the 2 sessions of history of our Book of Common Prayer. Next time we are together, I will provide an overview of what our prayer book contains. Most of us use the prayer book for worship, but there is so much more. Take care and God bless. I hope to see you during our next session. Goodbye.